Welcome to Religion Unveiled, where we dig deep into radical ideas. Today, we're looking at Lena Einhorn's timeline shift theory, which challenges the traditional dating of Jesus' life and death.
Right, it's a wild idea. So the claim is that Jesus might have actually lived in the 50s or early 60s AD instead of the 30s, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Instead of the usual timeline, Einhorn suggests that the historical Jesus actually inhabited a completely different period, 2 decades later.
That's such a big shift. I mean, why would someone even consider this? Isn't the traditional timeline, firmly established?
Well, Einhorn digs into the textual discrepancies between the New Testament Gospels and the accounts of the first-century historian Josephus. She argues that many Gospel events parallel accounts in Josephus. But interestingly, the timing in Josephus points not to the 30s, but to the 50s and 60s AD.
So, if I'm getting this right, what lookalike storylines are we talking about here?
It's like imagine this. The Gospels show a preacher who is charismatic and brings a message of peace, enters Jerusalem amid great fanfare, then ends up being executed by Roman authorities. But when you check Josephus, these kinds of events under names and descriptors show up later, during the reigns of governors like Felix, Albinus, and Florus.
Right, really interesting. That raises a lot of questions. If the account in Josephus is that, how do we reconcile the gospel narrative? Is it possible that the gospel writers, intentionally or not, shifted the timeline?
Exactly. And that's one of the most provocative parts of Einhorn's theory. She hints that the gospel narratives might actually be literary transplants. They could be taking real events from the tumultuous 50s, 60s period and moving them back to the 30s.
Yes. And the purpose behind that, does she provide any reasoning for why the early Christians might have made that adjustment?
Yes, she does. According to Einhorn, relocating these events could have been a political move. By setting these events in an earlier period, early Christians could have
that makes sense.
Depoliticized Jesus. It removes him from the very volatile events that were, leading up to the Jewish-Roman War.
So it's almost like they were trying to craft a narrative that offered a more palatable, less politically charged experience of Jesus, right?
Precisely. It frames Jesus' execution as a sort of unjust sacrifice rather than a political crackdown.
Exactly.
That way, his death doesn't come off as the end result of a failed rebellion, but as a meaningful, redemptive act.
I find that fascinating. But how does she support this theory? What kind of evidence does she present?
She zeroes in on discrepancies in dating and specific events. For example, she looks at 2 figures from Josephus, the Egyptian prophet and Theudas. Both are depicted as, revolutionaries or charismatic preachers leading large groups. Their actions, documented in Josephus, mirror the kinds of events the Gospels describe.
Right, I see what you mean. So she's essentially asking whether these episodes were reworked into the gospel narrative from episodes that actually occurred later than the traditional timeline.
Exactly. It's like a case study approach. It suggests that these parallel events aren't just coincidences, but might be intentional adaptations.
Yeah, that's a bold claim. But here's a thought. If the evidence in Josephus points consistently to the later decades, wouldn't that throw a massive wrench in our accepted historical dating?
It would. And that's why this theory is so controversial. Changing the timeline of Jesus not only challenges internal gospel consistency, but also how we understand the broader historical and cultural context of that era.
Absolutely. And then there's the political angle. Does Einhorn discuss why it was so important for early Christians to remove Jesus from the political scene?
Yes, she does. The idea is that by reassigning these events to the past, the early church could sidestep Roman suspicion after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD.
Yep,
Essentially,
I get that.
It was a survival tactic, a way to create a narrative that emphasized divine sacrifice over sedition.
It sounds like she's arguing that the narrative was deliberately crafted to serve a particular theological and political purpose.
You're right, and she isn't alone in this line of thought. Similar theories have been posited by scholars like Joseph Atwill, Robert Eisenman, and even Marcion. These theories suggest that the The gospel accounts may be composite memories, stories that blend historical facts with deliberate narrative crafting.
But isn't there a risk in reinterpreting these well-established texts? I mean, couldn't this approach be seen as undermining the historical credibility of the Gospels?
That's a valid critique, and one she addresses carefully. Einhorn isn't saying the entire narrative is a fraud. Rather, she's challenging the conventional timeline. It's more about recontextualizing the text to uncover layers of political and literary strategy.
I get it. But wouldn't this mean we have to re-examine other parts of the New Testament as well?
Definitely. If we start questioning the timeline on one front, it calls into question the entire framework of the narrative. It can lead us to ask, are the Gospels straightforward historical accounts, or are they like composite memory projects shaped by the realities and challenges of early Christian communities?
True. That could have huge implications for how we view not just Jesus, but the origins of Christianity itself.
Absolutely. It forces us to confront some foundational questions about historical memory, myth-making, and religious identity.
Right. Very thought-provoking indeed. And then there's the aspect of how this might affect our understanding of the Roman context, the change in governors, the different political climates between the 30s and the 50s, 60s.
Precisely, it's not just a minor date tweak. With different Roman political figures like Felix, Albinus, and Florus, the entire power structure and the associated events would reshape our historical narrative.
It's like rewatching a classic film with an entirely new ending. You start questioning every scene that led up to that moment.
That's a great analogy. A film where the director decides to play with the timeline to change the entire storyline. It makes you ask whether the original script was rewritten deliberately, or if it was, a revisionist rendering to fit new circumstances.
Exactly. Now, while this theory is indeed bold and fascinating, do you think there's enough textual evidence to support such a radical shift?
Well, that's the crux, isn't it? Einhorn's argument isn't ironclad proof. It's more like a compelling hypothesis. She leverages these textual parallels and timeline anomalies to suggest an alternative reading rather than offering a definitive answer.
Right, I see that nuance. So we're looking at a scenario where, if her theory holds water, it means reinterpreting not just isolated data points, but the entire narrative framework of early Christianity.
Exactly. It's a reminder that our historical narratives can be complex and layered, with texts that may serve multiple purposes, both political and theological.
Very true. And this discussion is important because it challenges us. If the dating of Jesus is off, then how many other assumptions about early Christian history might need to be revisited?
Yes, it brings us to that dangerous question. If the dates are wrong, then what else might be misunderstood? It invites us to rethink not just when Jesus lived, but who he might have been, and how his story was shaped by the world around him.
Absolutely, I agree. This is such a rich field for debate. Even if Einhorn's theory doesn't settle the matter, it prompts us to look at the interplay between memory, narrative construction, and political strategy in the formation of religious texts.
Exactly. It's an invitation to re-examine historical narratives with fresh eyes, even if it means challenging some long-held beliefs. Thanks for diving into this provocative theory with me.
Right, thank you indeed. And to our listeners, keep questioning and exploring. There's always more to uncover in the layers of history and faith.